Good morning, y'all. I am so honored to be here today. I'm really excited that you all gave me the opportunity to come and share a little bit about my experience. But before we get started, I wanted to get a sense of who all is here from across the valley. So who's here from Mission? Mission, okay. Who's here from Westlaco? No one? What about Edinburgh? Woo. And what about San Benito? All right, Ed Couch Elsa? Nice. Okay, well, I'm going to talk about an author from Ed Couch Elsa that really made an impact in my life. So, great. Well, so I was born and raised here in the Valley in McAllen. And I wanted to title my conversation Cruzando Fronteras, Crossing Borders, because I know that we are all a product of the RGV. And particularly at this time, there's been a lot of conversation about the border that hasn't always been positive. And so I want to make sure that we had an opportunity to change that narrative and talk about how growing up in the border actually, I think, and I will make the case, is exactly what the future needs. The perspective that it has given me and has given you is precisely the kind of perspective and voice that is needed for the future. So with that, I wanted to see if any of you all have heard of the concept of the story of self. Yes? Yes, awesome. So the story of self is this concept that is used in organizing, that the most impact that you can have is telling your story to find a collective value and then move people towards action. And so I wanted to begin there with my story of self. My parents are immigrants from Mexico. I am the daughter of Manuel and Maria Guadalupe Castillo, and they moved here when my brother was born with Down syndrome and a heart murmur. Doctors did not give him a lot of time to live, and so my parents wanted to make sure that they provided the best possible and opportunity and access for him with doctors. And so from a very early age, neither of my parents knew how to speak English. So I saw the struggle and their struggle in navigating the hospital, speaking to doctors, and even living here in the Valley where, I was not a minority. It was difficult for my parents to navigate the special education system. And my brother is now 33 years old. So, that's a miracle in and of itself. And I'm so thankful for that because he's nonverbal. And so he can't speak. So whenever something is bothering him, I had to learn very early on to try to see the world through his eyes. What was it that he was experiencing so that we could try to figure out what was bothering him? And I think learning that critical lesson of empathy, but also advocacy from such an early age is completely what grounded me as I began to really develop my social consciousness and awareness of my place in the community and the importance of self-advocacy and what that does. And so when I was about maybe in middle school, my mom was having a really hard time navigating some of the school systems. So she decided to go back to school and learn English. And so she was a seamstress, and that's how we would make ends meet. And so when I was little, I remember going to sleep to the sound of the sewing machine. And I would just hear it, and it would kind of lull me to sleep. And so as my mom started going to school, it became not just the sound of the sewing machine, but of her practicing English words. Like, she would ask me, ¿Cómo se dice that? And I'm like, it's the. And so we would practice together. And so I'm sure I'm not the only one that's had that experience with our parents. I knew that many a time I had to act as a translator for them. And that's really what I think of when I think of growing up in the Valley. It's being from here and from there. And I think of that Selena quote too when in the movie when her dad tells her, you have to be more Mexican than the Mexicans and you have to be more American than the Americans. And so as I was thinking about this, this conversation, this talk, I went back to a time when I left the Valley to go to school at UT Austin. And it wasn't until I was there, up until that point, I thought, oh, well, I know my story, I know my identity, I know my story of self. But I got there and I started taking courses, and I read this author who's from Ed.D also, Gloria Anzaldúa, and she talks about the border not being just a geographical space, but also being a metaphorical space, where you're constantly negotiating different ideas and figuring out how to navigate them. And so when I went to UT Austin, I read her writings and it opened my eyes to questions that I hadn't really considered before. And for those of you that might not be able to see the screen, so the quote that I chose for this piece was, the contributors to this bridge called My Back, which is a book that Gloria Anzaldúa wrote, were women of Native American, African American, Latin American, and Asian American backgrounds. And they wrote in full consciousness of the fact that they were once the colonized. And they pondered the question of who has the right to write culture for whom. And so it was this question of who's writing our textbooks, who's writing my history, who's writing our stories. When I started asking those questions, I thought, we never really learned the history of the Valley. And it wasn't until I was at UT Austin that I started learning the impact of economic policies and how that transitioned and how that changed the landscape of the border. And what that meant was these were stories that had impacted my family, your families, our ancestors, and they were completely silenced, for me at least, until I was in college. And that was a really powerful lesson for me to learn because it meant that the story of self is continuously evolving, and you are all in high school, and so you're about to embark on, go to college, and I would really impress upon you to try to take courses that tell you the history, that share history about the Valley and about our ancestors, because it is so critical. I think understanding our past is so critical to seeing how, to contextualizing the future. And so after that, I really started to think about how painful it was, not just for my parents, but then also to know that there was this complete history that I had missed out on and that I just discovered until I was in college. And it was that same sort of silencing that when I went to Harvard and I was in a place of so much power and privilege. Normally we think of Harvard and we think of, oh, geniuses or experts, and I'm not going to say that's not the case, but I also think that it can be intimidating. And I know that there were times when I was at the university and I questioned my ability, my place in that university. I thought, there's no way that I should be here. I'm just a girl from the Valley, and I don't think that I can compete with other students that have gone to the best private schools and have had access to infinite amount of privilege. But whenever that happened, I had friends and my husband, who I would, talk to, and I realized always that that voice, that imposter syndrome, It's something that people will face, but you have to shush it. But then you also have to realize that your experiences and your background are critically needed at the seat of power, at the seat of privilege, and that your perspective, you're the only one that has it. No one else does. And it is so important to be able to speak out and to be an advocate. Whenever that would happen, whenever I would feel like I don't belong here, I would think of my mom, and I would remember the sound of the sewing machine, and I would think, you know what? My mom must have had so much fear when she moved, but she still kept going because you have to for your family. That's what being an advocate means, and that's what pushes you forward. And that's precisely what happened for me when I was there. I kept thinking, I'm doing this because we need to have more students from the Rio Grande Valley in places like Harvard. We have so much ganas here. We have such a passion and commitment and the hard work ethic. Why shouldn't we be in places like Harvard or anywhere else for that matter? So it was really important to create a space of community, to find people who would support and understood the challenges that were happening, and you will find that. Even here in the Rio Grande Valley, it's so important to have these types of conversations with family and with friends. They'll keep you grounded. And then the other quote that I kind of wanted to share is, through that conversation that was happening of whether we belong or we don't, and finding that really empowerment, if you take away anything from this conversation, I want it to be this, that because, and I'll read it for those of you that are a little far away, the future will belong to the mestiza because the future depends on the straddling of two or more cultures. What I really wanted to share with you all is there's a lot of negative talk about the border, and that's not the whole entire story. Finding that you have straddled two different cultures, that your families who might be immigrants, or who, I know that I'm not the only one that has had this experience, is a strength, because it has allowed you to see the world from two different vantage points, from multiple vantage points. And I think that is so sorely needed, especially today. That is where I found my source of empowerment and self-advocacy, and I see the South Texas Ideas Festival as doing precisely that. It's offering you an opportunity to find that self-empowerment and advocacy, and then turn it into action. What are you going to do with this newfound knowledge that you have this perspective that is so needed in the world today? So I know that you all are going to be hearing from Congressman Vicente Gonzalez later on today. And I wanted you all to kind of think about, I was going to give you guys homework. I wanted you guys to think about who are your county commissioners? Who's your city mayor? Who are your city council members? Because they have the ability to make decisions that affect your community. And we need more of you guys in those positions of leadership, in public service. So I was reading a story maybe like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and there's this high school student from Round Rock, Texas, which is just a little north of Austin, and he's running for mayor of Round Rock. He's just so inspired and upset about the way that the political discourse has been lately, and he felt like his idealism and hope for his community can transform his city. So he decided to run for public office, and I thought that is so awesome. And that's exactly what I want to tell the students today and Saturday, that there is no reason why you shouldn't have a seat at that table. There's no reason why you can't be the next congresswoman or congressman for the Valley, or city commissioner or mayor, especially for you Latinas out here that I see. We need your voices. We need to have your experiences represented. And then the last quote that I will leave you with is, Caminante, no hay puentes, se hace puentes al andar. So there are no bridges, you build them as you go. And I wanted to remind you that as you are forging this path, you're not just doing it for yourself and for your family, you're doing it for the students and the folks that are coming behind you. You're blazing this path for them. And so I know that there's just wonderful things and wonderful ideas that you all are going to talk about today, and you're going to hear from different speakers with different experiences. And I hope that as you go home and you think about it, you think their story is not that different from mine. I can accomplish a lot more than the speakers that I heard from today, because I believe that you can, and we need you. We need you, and so I really hope that you can. So with that, I'll end, and if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to take any questions.